Hello team, Coach Tickety here, wanting to talk a little bit about tanks in Overwatch 2. So obviously tanking has changed a lot from Overwatch 1 to 2. With the reduction to a single tank in 5 vs 5 PvP, we can do away with definitions like main or off tanks, and instead we're left with a single hero on our teams to fulfill all of our tanking needs. But what exactly makes a tank a tank? Is it simply a higher HP pool? Is it the ability to lead their teammates into a fight? What about the ability to mitigate damage from opposing heroes? With such a diverse cast of heroes in Overwatch, there's no single correct tank definition or playstyle, and it's instead better to look at what specific areas each individual tank can excel at, which might help you determine which tanks suit your playstyle, and how to best play into their fundamental strengths. So let's take a look at what characteristics tanks possess in Overwatch. I've broken this down into 4 labels. I'm going to start off with probably the most obvious one, durability. And I'm defining this as how much a tank can absorb damage while either taking or holding space. This could probably be labeled as something like staying power or just general overall tankiness. And I want to make clear that this isn't just related to how high their HP pool is, but basically how long they can manipulate specific areas of the map. How long they can stay in a fight without having to give up space or without putting themselves at an inherent disadvantage. Number 2, initiative. And I'm defining this as how much a tank has the capacity to initiate a fight that benefits them and their team. This is related closely to mobility and could also be labeled something like engage potential. Third, and this one's pretty vague, we're calling utility. And for the purposes of this video, we're going to define this as how much a tank can offer their teammates to help defend or enable them. So this plays into the ability to peel, but also plays into the ability to enable another member of their team. I want to make a note here that any defensive utility used solely for themselves as the tank will be considered part of their durability rather than their utility. And the 4th and final characteristic I have here is simply damage. Very straightforward. This relates to how much damage potential the tank has, but also how important doing that damage is as part of their role as the tank. Using these 4 characteristics, let's break down a tank as an example. So let's take a look at Reinhardt, everyone's favorite German man with a hammer. So here I've got him with 4 durability, 3 initiative, 2 utility, and 4 damage. These values might seem surprising at first, but let me defend my choices here in a little bit of a breakdown in each characteristic. So for durability, obviously Reinhardt has one of the highest durability in the entire game. His high HP pool, his high amount of armor as part of that HP pool, and of course the flexibility of his shield to keep himself alive are all extremely valuable resources and puts him at the 4-star slot here. His initiative, not bad. I have him here with 3 stars, middle of the pack. While he does have a good opportunity to start fights by walking forward simply with his shield or even engaging with a charge, or of course with his ultimate, the Earth Shatter, it's not as strong as some other tanks with some gap closing ability, and you are inherently putting yourself at risk when you choose to use these things aggressively. You are forced to drop your shield anytime you charge or look for an Earth Shatter, and therefore it's not an always inherent advantage when you are choosing to initiate a fight as Reinhardt. It's something that needs to be thought of cautiously rather than haphazardly. For utility, again, we're looking middle of the pack here. While it doesn't have the most reach, Reinhardt's shield is an incredible source of utility for his team. Not only how healthy and big it is on the screen, but also its flexibility on how he can flash it up and down and how much exactly it can block. Keep in mind, shield will block things that not even D.va's defense matrix can block. And finally, we're looking at damage. And this one might be the most surprising stat for Reinhardt here in this list, but I have his damage up at 4 out of 5, simply because he has a high amount of burst damage. And in Overwatch 2 specifically, if you are picking Reinhardt as your sole tank, it is very important that he is able to farm up that damage by closing the gap on grouped up opponents, by hitting pins, by hitting his dual fire strikes, so that he can have a consistent threat of Earth Shatter every other fight or so, because that's such a core part of his identity as a tank. So doing damage as Reinhardt might not be the easiest thing, but the damage is extremely potent with how high the damage values are, and doing that damage is incredibly important for Reinhardt to find consistent value as the sole tank in Overwatch 2. From these 4 tanking characteristics, again, durability, initiative, utility, and damage, I've created 4 archetypes of tanks in Overwatch 2 that lean most heavily into these 4 characteristics. So first off, and this is probably a term that almost everyone at this point in the Overwatch player base is familiar with, are the anchor tanks, or just anchors here. So these are characterized primarily by that high durability stat, and we'll be looking at tanks like Orisa, Reinhardt, and Sigma for this role. To break down each individually, we already talked about Reinhardt, but looking at Orisa, her durability is through the roof. Not only does she have an incredible HP and armor pool for her base kit, but her Fortify and now her newly added Javelin Spin are both incredible tools for absorbing burst damage and surviving crucial moments during a teamfight. You could even look at her new ultimate Terra Surge as a form of durability, given that it procs Fortify on her for the duration of the ultimate. All this durability does have its cost though. Due to the linear nature of her kit, her initiative, utility, and damage are all middling to lower end for the tank slot. Sure, she can initiate fights by running in and trying to find a Terra Surge or looking for an energy javelin across the map to stun an opponent, but these are relatively hard to pull off and will often put you in a vulnerable position and can also be hard for your teammates to follow up. These are not necessarily abilities you want to start the fight with, but rather ones you would want to be able to react with in the middle of the fight after the enemy team is engaged on you. Looking at her utility, she has a lot of damage mitigation and reduction, but unfortunately, almost all of that is centered around Orisa herself. She doesn't offer a lot of damage mitigation or general utility for her teammates beyond being able to absorb priority cooldowns with Javelin Spin and being able to stun aggressive opponents with a well-timed and well-aimed energy javelin. Since these aren't as flexible as some of the other utility in the game, we've put her at a 2-star here. And finally, damage. While Orisa's damage is significant, it's not the most important part of her kit. It's rarely important that Orisa finds her combos during a team fight, and it's more so that she wants to use her kit to mitigate enemy damage, and the damage that she does in response is kind of a nice cherry on top. The damage that she does isn't one to be ignored for sure, but it's not something that you're going to play around inherently as a part of Orisa's kit, unless maybe you find yourself in the enemy backline. Next up, we already talked about Reinhardt, so let's jump right over to Sigma. Our final anchor tank has relatively low durability since while he can absorb a lot of damage, a lot of his game plan revolves around kiting space, which means he does have to in fact give up space, which according to our definition of durability doesn't put him at the top of the list. He still has a lot of staying power though with his flexible shield and with his kinetic grasp and a decent sized HP pool that gets augmented whenever he does absorb damage. His initiative, probably the lowest we're going to see on this entire list here. Sigma does not have any mobility in his kit. He does not have the ability to threaten characters at long range. He does not have a good time walking into a team fight directly, something like Reinhardt could do. So his initiative, unfortunately, is relatively weak compared to the rest of the cast. He is much better suited to taking and absorbing pressure rather than creating it and pushing into an enemy team. Utility-wise though, Sigma shines brightly. The sheer flexibility of his experimental barrier in that where you can deploy it, how quickly you can redeploy it after taking it down, and the amount of things it can block with good timing, in addition to having the kinetic grasp, which can of course absorb priority cooldowns, makes Sigma one of the highest utility tanks in the game. His ability to instantly react to pressure gives him this 4-star status. And finally, damage. Sigma's damage is very noticeable. Hitting the hyperspheres is an important thing to learn as part of your kit as Sigma, but it's not always the most important during a team fight. This is again one of those situations similar to Orisa, where you're going to find opportunities to change the pace of the team fight due to damage, but you're rarely going to be playing into that damage opportunity yourself. In Overwatch 2, as the solo tank Sigma, you're looking for more opportunities to shut down enemy damage dealers with your utility, more so than you're looking for opportunities to make yourself a DPS hero in your own right. For our next tank archetype, we are looking at Initiators. And of course, these are the tanks that revolve around a high initiative stat, and we're looking at tanks like Doomfist, Winston, and Wrecking Ball. Another word for these could obviously be dive tanks, or divers, as is commonly thrown around in Overwatch 1, but I wanted to play into this initiative value here. Of course, like I mentioned, our initiators will have a relatively high initiative stat, but will suffer in other areas. So let's take a look at Doomfist first. Number 1, durability goes through the floor. While he is technically now a tank and not a DPS in Overwatch 2, he did not get the same love that other tanks like our anchors got in terms of their durability. He is still very much a tank that will have to give up space when he is pressured out of situations, and usually at the cost of some of his movement cooldowns. He is not the tank that you want sitting in your front line for an extended team fight. He's the kind of hit and run tank that you would expect him to be coming from the DPS role. Of course, like we mentioned, his initiative is through the roof. His ability to close the distance and get on vulnerable members in the enemy backline is almost uncontested in the roster. In addition to this, because of how much explosive power Doomfist has, it's almost always a good thing when Doomfist is going first. This is why we put his initiative all the way up at 5 stars. You almost always want to be the one starting the fight as Doomfist, since there's so much you can do alone, let alone how much you can benefit your team by creating opportunities for them to follow up, or sometimes by just finding a solo kill in your own right. Utility, unfortunately, does not quite shine as brightly on Doomfist here. While he does have the power block to absorb important bursts of damage, this unfortunately is tied pretty directly to his own hitbox and won't do a good job of blocking for allies behind him. The utility here is actually coming from the slow and disruption provided from both his Rocket Punch and Seismic Slam, and also his ultimate Meteor Strike, which can lead to situations that benefit allied divers trying to finish up the kill when Doomfist is on his way out. And finally, damage. Like I mentioned, Doomfist did come from the DPS class previously, and while he has lost a decent chunk of his damage, he still is extremely bursty and has a still strong amount of one-shot potential, especially when he's able to charge up his Rocket Punch with the power block damage absorption. So there are plenty of opportunities we've seen where Doomfists are able to absolutely take control of a lobby just by the sheer amount of damage potential that they have. And since his initiation is often best followed up by himself and his own damage, this becomes a very important stat for Doomfist, which is why we have him up here at 4 stars. Next, in the initiators, we have Winston, everyone's favorite scientist. Winston obviously has a little bit stronger of a durability stat compared to Doomfist. He's got a higher HP pool, got some armor to boot, and he's also got the barrier that he provides not only for himself, but for his allies. So again, looking at the definition of durability, this isn't just the ability to stay in your front line, but the ability to hold and take space effectively. So Winston takes space well, and he's able to hold that space, which Doomfist cannot do, thanks to the aid of his protected barrier and his higher HP pool. Again, initiative here, we are talking about initiators. He doesn't quite have the same mobile flexibility that Doomfist has, so we had to bump him down to 4 stars, but he still is a great tank to start fights with both his jump pack and protected barrier, creating a lot of beneficial situations for both himself and his team, basically wherever you want to on the map. Utility drops a little bit lower here. Again, this falls mainly to his projected barrier, his bubble, since this is a great tool for denying enemy sightlines and enabling your allies to follow up aggressively. There is no better tool for helping an allied Tracer or Genji finish off a kill in the enemy backline, knowing that they've got that flexible bubble to play around themselves. This is also played into a little bit with his Primal Rage. Since the knockback from his punches during Primal Rage creates a lot of disruption, this is a great tool for setting up ally aggression or defending from enemy aggressors just as well. And finally, damage. While Winston's damage is somewhat important to his kit, his damage potential is not nearly as high as some of the other tanks in the roster, and so we put him at 2 stars here. While it is important to always be looking to do damage as Winston, to always be charging that Primal Rage and be zapping as many groups of players as possible, the damage is, frankly, somewhat ignorable most of the time in your average game, and the damage that Winston does find will mainly be there to create pressure rather than actual threat of killing anybody. And finally, in our initiation category here, we have Wrecking Ball. Looking at Wrecking Ball's durability, again, a reminder for this definition, the ability to not only take damage, but to take damage while taking or holding space. Wrecking Ball is one of those tanks, just like Doomfist, who does not hold space very well. He can get in, but he's very quickly got to get out, so his durability is down here at 2 stars. While he does have slightly more pressure than Doomfist, I would say, thanks to his adaptive shielding, he does not have the staying power of even someone like Winston does with the flexibility of his bubble. But of course, Wrecking Ball's initiative, just like Doomfist, is through the roof to make up for this. The ability for Wrecking Ball to engage on, isolate, and disrupt targets is unparalleled in the game, and it's just a matter of time before someone gets themselves caught in a 1v1 situation with a giant hamster ball. It's almost always a good thing for Wrecking Ball to be the first one engaging, and he can almost always find a way to turn those initiations into beneficial situations for his teammates. Utility-wise, though, Wrecking Ball offers almost nothing to his teammates. Again, the utility here, similar to Doomfist, isn't going to come from the ability to absorb damage, but actually the ability to enable aggression. And the best way Wrecking Ball does that is from boops from his engagements, and of course, the slam knock-up from his pile driver. Both of these are good opportunities for teammates to follow up, but both of which require some setup, some planning to hit, which makes them very weak tools when it comes to trying to peel defensively, which is why we put Wrecking Ball here at 1-star utility-wise. And finally, damage. Not the highest damage potential in the game, but nothing to ignore either. Wrecking Ball doesn't have the same burst potential as someone like Doomfist, but his damage is much more potent than even Winston's. Since his guns are hit scan, it makes it quite easy for Wrecking Ball to follow up especially single targets that he's able to disrupt out of position once he's taken their movement options away, and finding that damage is absolutely critical to make Wrecking Ball an active threat. It's one thing to be rolling around as a pinball, knocking players left and right. It's another thing entirely to be able to threaten the lives of those you've knocked out of position all by yourself. Alright, with high utility, we've got what I'm calling our first responders. And these are going to be D.va and Zarya at the moment. So first responders, of course, like I mentioned, best described by their utility. And again, utility being defined as the ability to basically help your allies either offensively or defensively. Since both of these heroes have primarily been seen as off-tanks in Overwatch 1, it becomes interesting to think about how these characters can best suit a team without another tank on the roster. So let's first take a look at D.va. Durability-wise, D.va's not bad, but not great. Again, similar to someone like Sigma, her ability to take damage is usually tied with her ability to leave the space she's currently occupying. However, with 3 seconds of Matrix and with the boosted HP pool that she got in Overwatch 2, her durability is significantly better than it was in Overwatch 1, and so we put her at 3 stars here. Initiative. While I did say this stat was closely tied to mobility, and there are few tanks as mobile as D.va, she unfortunately doesn't get much of an advantage by initiating onto an enemy team. And for enemy teams, this is just an opportunity to get past D.va's defensive utility and get into the meaty interior of their backline. Utility, of course, is where D.va shines, more so than any other character in the game. Her flexibility with both her mobility and her matrix makes her the ideal candidate to respond to almost any threat at any time. And conversely, she can also enable any threats of her teammates at almost any range, whether that's going aggressive with a diver like Tracer or Genji, or whether that's by looking defensively to create a long-range angle from DPS like Soldiers or Hanzos. And finally, damage-wise, D.va doesn't have the greatest damage potential in the game. She's got a little bit from her fusion cannons and a little bit more from her rockets, but the damage that D.va does, similar to Winston, is usually just an added form of pressure and rarely something that she plays around directly. She will find opportunities to isolate members and try to burn them down herself, but she's almost always instead playing around the damage of her DPS teammates. Next, and finally, in the first responders category, we have Zarya. Zarya is definitely in an interesting state in Overwatch 2, and she's seeing a lot of popularity in the Overwatch League at the highest level of play. But for the average lobby, how does Zarya look in Overwatch 2? So looking at the stats, durability, she didn't gain much from Overwatch 1, but she did gain flexibility in her bubbles. It's important to note for Zarya that while she has the potential to reach strong values here in all 4 characteristics, she isn't able to hit them all at the same time. And this is due to the cooldown nature of her 2 bubbles. So now in Overwatch 2, she can use both of her bubbles on either herself, on 2 allies, or on the same ally twice, or any combination of allies and self. So looking at how she becomes a durable tank doesn't come from the ability to take a lot of hits directly, but the ability to use 2 bubbles on herself now compared to Overwatch 1. Zarya, if pushed directly when she has both bubbles available, can be actually surprisingly one of the most durable tanks in the game with the amount of damage she can absorb and the amount of time she can buy her teammates. Unfortunately, she still lacks a lot when in the initiation department. She doesn't have a lot of opportunities to start a fight given her lack of mobility, her ground-based nature, and of course her relatively short range. Utility-wise though is where Zarya now shines. With the ability to bubble not only 1, but 2 teammates during a fight, she creates a lot of opportunities for both aggression or defensive pressure from her DPS or support line, and can also sit in a comfortable middle ground being able to react to both situations. How we're seeing this play out in the Overwatch League, for example, is seeing aggressive DPS like Genjis or Reapers go heavily aggressive, knowing that they've got Zarya's utility to warrant that aggression. And this doesn't come at the cost of Zarya being able to peel defensively for her backline, say a support lineup of Ana and Lucio, since she can also use her second bubble if the enemy gets aggressive during the same moment. And finally, damage. Zarya's damage is incredibly important, and this is not only because she does a lot of damage, but because in order for Zarya to be an actual threatening member of the team, she needs to maintain high charge from her bubbles, otherwise she can go basically ignored. So damage here we're putting all the way up at 5 stars, again, not only because Zarya does a lot of damage while at full charge, but it's incredibly important that Zarya is able to do that damage in order to actually function as a frontline member of the team. If Zarya isn't able to do damage or isn't able to gain charge effectively, she becomes a much weaker tank as part of the team, and therefore requires a strong focus on her damage output. And finally, our final category. Does anyone realize who we've been missing all this time? I don't have a name for this category, but as arguably the only tank in the game that plays extremely heavily around damage, Zarya was almost there, but not quite. But as the only tank in the game that plays heavily around damage, we're giving Roadhog his own category. Hey team, just wanted to jump in here to say that we've been working on this video since before the Junker Queen reveal, so obviously she won't be making an appearance here, but what we've seen so far from her kit makes it look like she will fit into this damage heavy tanking role as well. Looks like the Junkers will have a category all to themselves. Be sure to check out my channel for an in-depth look at Junker Queen's kit as soon as we get our hands on her when the beta drops on June 28th. So Roadhog unfortunately didn't get too many changes since Overwatch 1, and is effectively just a fat DPS. His durability, initiative, and utility are somewhat negligible since his durability is there since he can take damage with his high HP pool and with his take a breather being able to heal himself up and provide damage mitigation, but he doesn't really care about durability. His initiative is there. He can be the first one into a fight. He can be the one looking in the front line to create a hook opportunity. He can be the one walking around on flanks to create threatening opportunities into the enemy backline. But more often than not in Overwatch 2, since he is now the only tank on his team, it becomes relatively easy to scout Roadhog's ability to cover the map since he is ground-based and doesn't possess any mobility in his kit. I have his initiative up here at 2 stars since while the threat potential of hook is there, I can't give it any higher than 2 stars since realistically, it's not that easy to find hooks as the first cooldown going into a fight. Utility, Roadhog literally offers nothing to his teammates other, I guess you could argue, I'm struggling to defend this. Roadhog literally possesses no utility to offer his team other than to defensively hook a target off of one of his teammates, which realistically plays more into his damage potential than his utility potential. So this is why Roadhog is a uniquely singular focused hero in the tank slot around his damage. And simply put, you're either getting kills and carrying your team as Roadhog, or you're not able to find those hooks, you're not able to find those kills, and you're just a single focused heavy set DPS. There's not much to say about Roadhog in Overwatch 2. I think he unfortunately suffers a lot more than any other tank in the roster due to the 5v5 nature of Overwatch 2, and will struggle to find the same opportunities he does find in Overwatch 1. Alright, so again, that breaks down my thoughts about how to look at tanks in Overwatch 2 and what these different tank characteristics can tell us about how these tanks would like to play in a game of Overwatch 2. Keeping in mind Overwatch 2 going 5 vs 5 now, a lot more is on the shoulders of your tank line now that it's just a single player, but not every tank can do everything. Try to focus on what your tanks do well, try to find a playstyle or a tank roster that suits you, and make sure that you're able to get the most enjoyment and most success out of your tank picks without trying to be able to do all the things that tank duos can do in Overwatch 1. But those are just my opinions. Let me know what you guys think in the comments down below. I would love to hear you guys' opinion on what tanks feel OP, what tanks feel underpowered, how Roadhog is actually the best tank in the game and I have no idea what I'm talking about. Let me know down below. But otherwise, that's it for the video. I'd like to give a shout out to Questline Esports. They've been helping me out a ton produce these videos. They've been doing all the work on the editing and everything and making sure that I'm able to put out this content. So a huge shout out to them. There'll be a link to their channels down below. And also be sure to check out the show High Ground that we do every Monday evening on their Twitch channel, where we talk about the Overwatch League storylines, our impressions about how the game is going, and basically anything spicy that happened on Twitter the week before. But that's all for me today, guys. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you guys next time.